I grew up in the 90s, and I remember stand-up comedy being one of the best things to watch on TV. And the Comedy Store in Los Angeles actually has a lot to do with that. They're known for prepping and pushing some of our favorite comedians to the very top over the years, people like Robin Williams and Chris Farley. Most people associate the Comedy Store with happiness and laughter, of course, but according to many of the comedians who have worked there over the years, and plenty of the staff also, there's a heaviness to it. A vibe that cannot be denied. Given the Comedy Store's very dark past, it's really not hard to believe that it's one of the most haunted places in America, even though it's never talked about. Located on Sunset Boulevard, the Comedy Store opened in April of 1972, but before that, it was owned by a few different people and had a few different names. Back in the 1700s, when California was still a part of Mexico, where Sunset Boulevard is today, there used to be a very popular cattle route. And a lot of people used to take this trail. It was so popular, in fact, that criminals and bandits would often be on this trail as well. These bandits would rob and kill people, and they would bury their bodies within the hills of the surrounding area. Well, when they bulldozed the area to create what would be now the Sunset Strip, they uncovered hundreds of skeletons. So they basically bulldozed over a burial ground, which cannot be good. Moving along now to the 1920s, the area became really populated, and it was actually called Marshallville at the time. And it wasn't even a part of LA either, it was more like an unincorporated township. But the area got so populated that the town of LA discussed if they wanted to incorporate Marshallville, and at first they didn't want to. They didn't want it mainly because they were intimidated. They were intimidated by this growing population and the undesirable people that came along with it. And these people were living out their freedoms without any fear of the police getting involved. Now again, this was back in the 1920s when Prohibition was happening. So these clubs and speakeasies and brothels and casinos were really just a cover so that they could sell alcohol illegally in the back. Sunset Boulevard is also a very long road. It goes through many different districts and it basically ends at the Pacific Ocean. It also runs right through Hollywood, so a lot of actors would finish shooting for the day at the studio and they would venture on up the Sunset Strip to Marshallville, where they would drink and gamble and visit the brothels, of course. Also, being gay at this time was very disapproved of, but it wasn't a problem in Marshallville. This was a community of people who were escaping the oppressions of society and even the oppressions from the LAPD. They had no worries there at all. But since the place was creating such a buzz and had so much money coming into it, you know who had to get involved: the mob. On New Year's Eve in 1935, Club Seville opened its doors for the first time, and it was so cool because it showcased a see-through dance floor that had an aquarium underneath. But the unfortunate thing was people were so afraid that the glass was going to break that no one wanted to dance on it, so having a full house at this club was very rare. In the club were different rooms, different main rooms, and one of the rooms was called the belly room, and this is where the mob would force their sex workers to get extremely dangerous and illegal abortions done, because if they were pregnant, they couldn't make money for them, so they would force them to get these horrible abortions. They never changed the name either. It's still known as the belly room in the Comedy Store today. It's also one of the most haunted places in the store, and it's also ironically where most female comics get their start. That's where most women perform first at the club. Going back to Club Seville though, since everyone was afraid of the dance floor, no one really showed up, so they kind of only lasted about a year before they ended up selling the place. So getting into the 1950s now, the club was sold and remodeled basically. They got rid of that dance floor, and it was eventually renamed Ciro's, and it was owned by Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel was known to hang out with another mobster named Mickey Cohen, and Mickey Cohen was very well known in the LA area, and eventually he made Ciro's his #1 hangout spot. Bugsy and Mickey were known to love the high life, and they were often hanging out with celebrities and spending all kinds of money that they probably shouldn't have spent. At this time, Mickey was also warring it out with another gangster named Jack Dragna, so Mickey had holes put into the walls of Ciro's facing out into the street so that they could shoot their rivals right where they stood and no one would even see it coming. There was actually a lot of violence surrounding Ciro's at this time. It's even said that they would sometimes chain their rivals up in the basement of the club so that they could torture them and try to get more information out of them before they killed them and threw them in a lake somewhere. There's even some rumors that there's a tunnel underneath Ciro's that goes to the street behind the club, and apparently there's even some money buried back there. Mickey also had a doorman named Gus, but Gus was more than just a doorman. He was very involved with the mob and suffered a fate of his own because of it. It's said that Gus was shot and killed in the green room, which leads to the main room, because that's basically where people see his ghost all the time.
And his name is Gus. Do you know that?
Is that his name?
That's his name, bro. Gus, dude. I've seen Gus twice, bro.
Eventually, though, Ciro's was sold again to Sam and Mitzi Shore, who are the parents of Pauly Shore, and they turned it into the Comedy Store as we know it today. In the beginning, it was a place for starving comedians to practice their jokes on a stage with an audience. Mitzi would let anybody who showed up perform, but the downside was no one got paid for any of their work. And in fact, a lot of the comedians would end up sleeping there at night because they had nowhere else to go. Eventually, the comedians would create a strike because they were tired of not being paid for their work, and Mitzi would watch with tears in her eyes as these comics that she nurtured over the years were basically turning against her. Mitzi would say that the club was never about profit. It was and always had been a showcase and a training ground for young comedians to perfect their craft. But after she watched them picket all around the store, right in front of her office window, yelling demands at her, she finally caved and gave them what they wanted. Mitzi agreed to pay each comedian $25 a piece after their sets, and their sets were only about 15 minutes long, so it really wasn't a bad deal. Not to mention, a lot of the comedians were on the up and up already because of their performances at the Comedy Store. Some of them were even on TV now, but even they weren't getting paid that much. A few of the comedians that demanded the money and were the ones that kind of started this whole thing were David Letterman, Jay Leno, and Steve Lubetkin. Steve Lubetkin really seemed to get the short end of the stick, though. Him and Mitzi were pretty close before the strike, and when the strike happened and she felt betrayed by Steve, she basically used her powers in Hollywood to blacklist him. He was not getting any jobs anywhere. All of his TV performances were canceled. He wasn't getting nowhere. Not only was he not getting jobs anywhere else, but he was also totally fired from ever performing at the Comedy Store ever again. And this made him incredibly depressed. He was so completely distraught by this that he committed suicide by jumping off the roof of the hotel right next door to the Comedy Store. Apparently, Steve's plan was to land on the roof of the Comedy Store, but it didn't really work out like that. Unfortunately, he missed, and he fell between the hotel he jumped from and the Comedy Store, and he landed on a metal pipe that was sticking up out of the ground, and he had a note in his hand that said, "My name is Steve Lubetkin. I used to work at the Comedy Store." There are so many ghost stories about this place, especially from Joey Diaz and Bobby Lee. I'm going to put some links in the description box if you guys are interested in any of the stories, but I just think it's really interesting. Given the past of this place, it has to be one of the most haunted places in America, yet no one ever talks about it. So, I had to do it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, and if you're new here, why don't you go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys very soon.